Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.
The pole creaked. A rough-hewn beam jutted out from the volcanic cliff, swaying over the molten abyss. Bound wrists, rope biting into pale blue skin, a girl dangled above the roaring fire. Sienna. Naked, trembling, her hair stuck to her damp face as ash drifted down like snow. The hemp ropes cut deeper with each sway, blood trickling along her forearms in thin blue lines. Volcanic ash clung to her cracked lips, each breath drawing bitter particles into her lungs. From below, the crowd's chant distorted her name into something unrecognizable. Sienna, becoming Sienna, a ritual pronunciation that stripped away her identity before her body would be consumed. Below, the volcano breathed, a living throat of flame. Every inhale was a growl, every exhale a roar that sent waves of crimson light dancing across the obsidian walls of the caldera. The heat blistered her skin, raising welts that pulsed with each throb of her racing heart. The next tremor would break the pole. She knew it. They all knew it. The crowd gathered on the neighboring ledges, howled with anticipation. Hundreds of her people, families she had grown up with, children she had played with, now watched with hungry eyes. Some wept silently, their tears evaporating in the heat before they could fall. Others chanted with the elders, their voices a thunderous chorus calling for purification. "Let her burn! Let her burn!" A child's voice pierced the cacophony, the words learned by rote without understanding. Sienna recognized the voice. Little Thera, barely 6 seasons old, daughter of the woman who had taught Sienna to weave. How quickly they turned when the elders commanded. On the cliff above, the elders stood in a half circle, their bodies wrapped in ceremonial fabrics woven with metallic threads that caught the volcanic glow. Their faces were painted with symbols of judgment, ancient markings that had sentenced thousands before her. They chanted, voices cracking like dry wood, carrying the weight of law older than memory. Defiance burns. Obedience rises, they intoned, the words echoing across the chamber. Through fire, the impure are cleansed. In the center stood Matron Kiva, oldest of the elders, her skin the deepest blue of their people, almost indigo with age. The ceremonial marks on her face weren't paint, but permanent scars, carved during her ascension ritual 60 years before. Her eyes were clouded white, yet somehow she always saw everything. Behind the elders stood Krell, his massive frame silhouetted against the fires. Unlike the other warriors with their ritual scars and ceremonial armor, Krell wore the marks of true battle, a jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, received in combat with rival clans. 3 metal rings pierced his lower lip, one for each wife he had broken. Now he watched Sienna with naked hunger, as if her imminent death was merely a temporary inconvenience to his desires. This was the right of the impure. She had rejected the warrior chosen for her, Krell, with his scarred face and cruel hands that had already broken 3 wives. When he came to claim her, she had spit in his face. Now her defiance was to be burned away. "You will accept him as the stars intended," Matron Kiva had whispered during the binding ritual, her breath hot against Sienna's ear. "In this life or the next, your spirit will learn submission." Sienna forced herself to look down into the blaze. Streams of molten rock twisted below her like living serpents of light. Death was agony, but it was freedom. Her ancestors had taught that the stars were their first home, that their spirits returned there when flesh failed. If she had to burn to be free, so be it. She thought of her grandmother's stories, how their people had fallen from the night sky in ships of metal and light, how the old technologies had failed, and how they had learned to live with the volcano. "The stars remember us," her grandmother would say, "and someday they will call us home. Better to burn and return to the stars," she whispered, throat raw from the heat, "than live as someone's possession." The pole groaned, tilting another inch. Heat seared her throat. A small rock broke free from the cliff face and tumbled into the lava, dissolving instantly with a hiss that made her flinch. The rope holding her wrist slipped a fraction further. Sienna closed her eyes. She wouldn't scream. She wouldn't give Krell or the elders that satisfaction. She thought of her mother, who had also died in the fire 5 years before, not for defiance but for the crime of teaching forbidden stories to the children. Stories of a time before the elders ruled, when women and men stood equal. Then through the storm of ash, a human voice cut across the chants like a blade. "She's mine!" The chanting died. The elders froze, their painted faces turning toward the intrusion. Even the volcano seemed to hush, its roar diminishing to a low rumble. The crowd fell silent, a collective breath held in shocked disbelief. He walked out of the smoke, broad-shouldered, scarred, a man who carried war in his gait. His skin was weathered copper, marked with the faint traces of battle that no regeneration treatment could fully remove. A network of thin white lines crossed his exposed forearms and neck, telling stories of survival where others had fallen. Ronan, once a military advisor to the Confederacy, now a negotiator exiled to dust worlds. His name was whispered among both the settlers and the indigenous peoples of a dozen borderland planets. Some called him peacemaker, others traitor. The crowd stirred, murmuring in their native tongue. Many had never seen an off-worlder before, except in ancient hollows or religious murals that depicted them as demons. A few made warding signs with their fingers, 3 quick circles followed by a slashing motion. To them, his arrival was an omen worse than the sacrifice itself. "Outsider demon," someone shouted. "The fire will take you too." Ash clung to his torn cloak, a garment that might once have been military issue but was now stripped of insignia and rank. The crowd hissed as he stepped toward the pole, his boots leaving deep impressions in the volcanic soil. 2 warriors moved to intercept him, ceremonial spears leveled at his chest. Ronan didn't break stride. He moved with the fluid precision of someone who had spent decades in combat situations. Before either warrior could react, he had sidestepped the first spear, caught the shaft, and used the warrior's momentum to send him sprawling. The second warrior lunged, but Ronan was no longer where he had been. A swift strike to the warrior's wrist, and the spear clattered to the ground. He raised his voice, gravel and steel. "By Clause 9, C of the Accord of Joined Worlds, I invoke the right of mutual bond." Gasps, shouts. The law was real but ancient, written in treaties no one read anymore. It had been created during the early days of contact, when peace between worlds hung by a thread. It allowed a representative of one world to claim protection over a citizen of another, a diplomatic shield designed to prevent executions that might spark war. None had dared to claim it in living memory. The elders sputtered, furious. The oldest among them, Matron Kiva, stepped forward, her ceremonial staff striking sparks from the stone. "This law is not meant for this. It cannot apply," she began, voice shaking with rage. "She has defied our most sacred traditions. The off-worlder has no standing here." The crowd's mood shifted from shock to anger. Voices rose in protest. First a few, then dozens. "Kill them both! Demon lover! Throw him in the fire!" Some began to advance, emboldened by numbers. A stone flew from the crowd, striking Ronan's shoulder. He didn't flinch. "Your traditions demand respect for ancient law," Ronan said, his voice carrying across the chamber. "The accord was signed by your ancestors when the stars still spoke to them directly. Would you break faith with them?" The words hit their mark. The elders exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering across their painted faces. Even in their corruption, they feared the old taboos. To openly defy the laws of the ancestors would undermine their own authority. Matron Kiva stiffened, then spat on the ground between them. "Our laws supersede outsider treaties. The stars themselves demand her sacrifice." "Then let the stars witness what follows," Ronan replied. But Ronan reached inside his coat. He drew his military insignia, a small disc of metal and crystal, etched with the coordinates of his home system and his service number. It was the last link to his people, his career, his name. With a steady hand, he tossed it into the fire. It hissed in the lava, gone forever, the metal flaring with strange colors as it melted. In the Confederacy, such an act was irreversible, a formal renunciation that could never be undone. His identity, his citizenship, his past, all of it dissolved with that small disc. "I renounce rank, title, and kin," he said, the words heavy with finality. "I am exile, but she is under me now." The crowd fell silent, recognizing the weight of the ritual, even if they didn't understand its origin. Such absolute sacrifice resonated with their own traditions. To give up everything for a principle was the highest form of honor in their culture. The nearest warrior, Krell himself, the rejected suitor, roared and leapt, blade flashing in the volcanic light. He slashed toward the rope to send the girl down before the law sealed. "She burns!" Krell shouted, his face contorted with rage. "No outsider claims what is mine." Ronan met him mid-swing. His fist crashed into the warrior's jaw. Bones shattered, blood sprayed into the ash. The sound of the impact echoed across the chamber like a gunshot. The man collapsed, twitching, his ceremonial blade clattering to the ground. The crowd recoiled in superstitious terror. For generations, Krell had been undefeated in combat, his strength considered a blessing from the stars themselves. To see him fall with a single blow challenged everything they believed about power and favor. The elders recoiled. The pole shook violently. Sienna screamed. The rope slipped another inch. She could feel the fibers stretching, beginning to snap one by one. If he was too late, the volcano would claim her first. Ronan lunged for the pole. His fingers closed around the rough wood just as the final strand of rope gave way. For a heartbeat, Senna hung suspended in air, ash swirling around her, the heat of the volcano rushing up to embrace her. Then his hand caught her wrist. Pain shot through her arm as her full weight pulled against his grip. She looked up, eyes wide, to find his face inches from hers. His eyes were the color of steel in twilight, focused and unflinching. "Hold on," he said, voice low enough that only she could hear. Their eyes met in that suspended moment. All her life, Sienna had been taught that off-worlders were soulless, creatures of metal and electricity, not flesh and spirit. But in his eyes, she saw something her people's stories had never mentioned: compassion. With a grunt, he pulled her up, muscles straining against the weight. As soon as she cleared the edge of the cliff, he sliced through her bindings with a small blade that had appeared in his hand. He wrapped his cloak around her naked form in a single fluid motion. The elders stood frozen, the law paralyzing them more effectively than any weapon could have. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their religious certainty shaken by what they had just witnessed. According to the oldest stories, the fire never relinquished its claim. Yet here she stood, unburned. Krell stirred on the ground, blood pooling beneath his shattered jaw. His eyes burned with hatred as he tried to rise, fingers clawing at the ash. "Stay down," Ronan warned, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had given death more times than he could count. Krell hesitated, then subsided, his warrior's instinct recognizing a superior predator. Ronan lifted Sienna into his arms and backed away from the edge, his eyes never leaving the assembly. "By your laws and mine," he said, voice carrying across the chamber. "She lives." Matron Kiva raised her staff, ancient symbols glowing along its length. "This changes nothing," she hissed. "The law speaks, but so does the fire. It will have her, or both of you." At her gesture, the remaining warriors began to spread out, cutting off access to the main tunnel. Their movements were cautious now, respecting the threat Ronan represented, but they outnumbered him 15-1. "There," Senna whispered, her lips barely moving. She inclined her head toward a narrow fissure in the rock wall, almost invisible in the flickering light. "Service tunnel, used by the fire readers." Ronan nodded once, imperceptibly. He turned, carrying her toward the tunnel that led out of the caldera. No one moved to stop them directly. Only the volcano spoke, its rumble rising once more like distant thunder. They fled through tunnels carved by centuries of lava flow. The air stank of sulfur. Their footsteps echoed in the ash dark. Occasional tremors sent pebbles cascading from the ceiling, and the distant glow of magma painted the walls with shifting shadows. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew, metal scraping on stone, guttural commands in the local dialect, the distinctive rhythm of warriors trained to hunt in the volcanic maze. "Left here," Sienna directed, her voice stronger now. "The main tunnel branches. They'll divide their forces." Ronan followed her direction, noting how intimately she knew these passages. These weren't random escape routes. She had planned for this, or something like it. They took the left fork, then immediately ducked into a low crawl space that Sienna indicated with a nod. They crouched there in darkness, breathing silently as heavy footsteps thundered past. The warriors continued down the main tunnel, their voices fading. "Fire readers?" Ronan asked when it was safe to speak again. "The old priests," she explained as they resumed their journey through narrower, less traveled passages. Before the elders consolidated power, they communed with the volcano, interpreted its moods. The elders had them executed 3 generations ago, but kept their secret paths. How do you know about them? A bitter smile crossed her face. My grandmother was the last fire reader. She passed the knowledge to my mother, who passed it to me. That's another reason they wanted me dead. They moved swiftly through the honeycomb of tunnels, avoiding the main passages where warriors would be searching. Twice they had to backtrack when they heard voices ahead. At a narrow intersection, they encountered 2 guards. Ronan pushed Sienna behind him and engaged them before they could sound an alarm. He fought with economic precision, no wasted movement or energy. One guard went down with a crushed windpipe, the other with dislocated shoulders. You didn't kill them, Sienna observed as they moved past the unconscious forms. Not unless necessary, Ronan replied. They follow orders. The fault lies higher. Further in, they reached a chamber where superheated steam vented from fissures in the floor. The passage ahead was partially collapsed, leaving only a narrow ledge along one wall. As they edged along it, the ledge began to crumble under Ronan's weight. Sienna had already reached the other side. She turned back, seeing him start to fall toward the scalding vents below. Without hesitation, she grabbed a hanging stalactite, swung out over the gap, and extended her hand. "Jump!" she commanded. Ronan leapt as the ledge disintegrated. Their hands locked, and Sienna's strength surprised him as she helped pull him to safety. For a moment, they stood face to face, their roles reversed, savior and saved. "Now we're even," she said, something like respect flickering in her eyes. They continued deeper into the mountain, the sounds of pursuit growing distant. Eventually, they reached a small chamber where several tunnels converged. Sienna collapsed against the wall, exhaustion finally catching up to her. Sienna was free, but her face twisted with fury. She pushed against his chest until he set her down, letting her walk on her own. The cloak hung from her shoulders, barely covering her, but dignity seemed to matter more to her than modesty. "You humiliated me, Offworlder," she said. Her voice was hoarse but sharp as glass. Each word carefully formed as if it cost her great effort to speak instead of scream. "You think yourself a hero? I saved your life." "Life?" She laughed, a sound like stones breaking. "You think salvation is what you've given me? Death is the path to the stars." Her words hit harder than the heat. To her, death was honor. To her, his claim was worse than fire. He had pulled her from one form of bondage only to claim her for another. Or so she believed. He clenched his jaw but kept walking. "I claimed you to save you. Nothing more. Your claim makes me property. Under you, you said." She spat the words. "How are you different from Krell?" "Krell wanted to own you. I want to free you." "Word," she dismissed. "Your confederacy speaks of freedom while binding worlds and treaties." "The confederacy is not perfect," Ronan acknowledged, "but its laws can protect when properly invoked." "Laws?" Her laugh was bitter. "Your laws allow corporations to buy and sell planets. Our laws at least acknowledge that we belong to the stars, not to men." The question hung between them as they navigated the winding tunnels. Sienna knew these passages. They were part of her people's sacred geography, mapped in songs that children learned before they could walk. Even in her anger, she found herself guiding their steps, avoiding dead ends and unstable passages, with subtle changes in direction. "Why did you really save me?" she asked suddenly. "Truth, Offworlder. You didn't cross light years for a stranger's execution." Ronan hesitated. "I came tracking illegal resource contracts, corporate exploitation disguised as cultural exchange. So I'm just useful to you." Something flickered across her face. Disappointment, perhaps. "At first," so he admitted, "but when I saw what they were doing to you..." He stopped, struggling to articulate something he didn't fully understand himself. "I couldn't stand by and watch. Not again." "Again?" She caught the word immediately. Ronan's shoulders tensed. "On Viridian Prime, I followed orders. Look the other way while the corporations are located in indigenous communities. Thousands died." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I won't be that man again." The tunnel trembled, not the minor tremors they'd felt before, but a substantial quake that sent chunks of ceiling raining down. A fissure opened in the floor ahead, glowing red-hot as magma surged up from below. "This way." Senna pulled him down a side passage as a geyser of flame erupted behind them, scorching the air where they'd stood moments before. There! Senna pointed to a natural bridge of cooled lava, spanning a chasm of molten fire. The ancient formation glistened with embedded crystals that caught the dim light, creating a pathway that seemed to float on air itself. They were halfway across when the bridge began to sing, a high, crystalline tone that grew in intensity. The vibrations weren't random tremors, but a deliberate alarm. "Ancestral warning system," Senna whispered. "Someone's following." The crystalline surface beneath Ronan's foot suddenly liquefied, returning to its molten state as if the centuries of cooling had been reversed in an instant. His leg plunged into empty space, the bubbling magma below casting his face in crimson light. Senna lunged back, her fingers closing around a handful of his jacket. For a critical moment, she was his only anchor to safety. With a grunt of effort, she pulled him back from oblivion. "That's twice you've saved me," he said when they reached the other side, his voice tinged with newfound respect. "The stars keep count," she replied, touching the ceremonial marks on her wrist. They pressed on through a labyrinth of passages. The ritual had left her weak, but determination fueled each step. Ahead, a narrow crevice offered the only path forward. "We'll have to squeeze through," Ronan said, examining the tight opening. The sound of magma flowing deep within the mountain's veins surrounded them, a rhythmic pulse that resonated through the stone beneath their feet. To Senna, it sounded like the labored breathing of some ancient beast. She had been taught since childhood that the volcano was the planet's living heart, and now it seemed the planet itself was rejecting her, hunting her through its arterial tunnels. "It hates me," she whispered, more to herself than to Ronan. "My own world wants me gone." "Not the world," he replied, surprisingly gentle. "Just those who claim to speak for it." As Senna pressed her palm against the wall to steady herself, the stone began to glow. Ancient symbols appeared beneath her fingers, responding to something in her blood. Genetic markers from her ancestors who had built this place. "What's happening?" Ronan asked. "The mountain remembers," she whispered, awed. The passage widened before them, stone flowing like liquid. Behind them it sealed just as swiftly, cutting off any pursuit. The ancestors' technology, dormant for generations, awakened at her touch. They emerged into the heart of the mountain. Not merely a chamber, but a vast cathedral of science. A forgotten observatory where holographic stars rotated slowly across the dome ceiling. Crystalline instruments stood on pedestals, their functions lost to time, but their beauty undimmed. "The celestial nexus," Senna breathed. "I thought it was just a children's tale." As they walked, memories washed over Senna, images of the friends who had been taken before her. Lyra, her childhood companion, given to a warrior 3 times her age, returning from her joining ceremony with empty eyes. Estha, who had run when they came for her, caught and dragged back, screaming. She had stopped speaking afterward. Senna had vowed never to end that way. She stumbled suddenly, her leg giving out beneath her. Blood streaked her calf where sharp stone had sliced through skin. She bit back a cry but couldn't rise. Ronan knelt beside her, assessing the wound. "It needs cleaning. The volcanic dust could cause infection." "Leave it," she said through gritted teeth. "We need to keep moving." Ronan hesitated, then tore a strip from his already ragged shirt. He pulled his water flask from his belt and carefully cleaned the wound before binding it. "Why help me when I've shown you nothing but contempt?" she asked, watching his hands work with practiced efficiency. "Because everyone deserves dignity," he said simply, "even those who hate me." The words struck her with unexpected force. In her world, mercy was weakness. Compassion was reserved for kin alone. Yet this stranger tended her wound as if it mattered. Senna thought of her mother in that moment, Elena, the storyteller, who had taught forbidden history in whispers, who had been discovered and sentenced to purification by fire. Senna had been forced to watch as her mother burned. "I watched my mother die in the fire," she said suddenly, voice hollow. "I was 13. She had been teaching the old songs, the ones that spoke of women leading alongside men. "I'm sorry," he said, and the simple sincerity in his voice cracked something in her. When they bound her to the pole, she looked at me. Not at the fire. "At me," Senna's voice caught. "I never knew what her last words were meant to be." "Maybe she was telling you to live," Ronan suggested quietly. He lifted her gently, one arm supporting her weight as they continued through the chamber. For the first time, she didn't pull away. The tunnel opened into a cavern older than memory. Walls of obsidian gleamed with mosaics of stars, a forgotten observatory carved into the mountain. Dust-coated collapsed instruments, but the ceiling still held fragments of constellations, maps rendered in precious metals and crystalline substances. "The star chamber," she whispered with reverence. "I thought it was just a story." Ancient pedestals stood in concentric circles around a central platform. On each pedestal rested the remnants of observation devices. Tubes of crystal and metal pointed toward specific sections of the ceiling. "What is this place?" Ronan asked. "The old histories say our ancestors built chambers to read the stars." She ran her fingers over a mosaic, a spiraling pattern of white stones against black volcanic glass. "These are navigation charts." "Navigation?" Ronan examined the patterns with new interest. "Your people were spacefaring." "Once," Santa nodded. "The elders teach that we fell from the stars as punishment for pride. But my mother's story said we came here by choice, explorers, not exiles." She pointed to a specific constellation embedded in the ceiling. "The Confederacy calls that the Cygnus Arm. We call it the Path of Return." Her voice softened. "When I was little, my mother would point to it in the night sky and say, 'That's the road home, Santa. Never forget.'" Ronan studied the star map, recognition dawning. These aren't just decorative. They're precise stellar cartography showing navigational routes. He pointed to a specific pattern. "That's the Helios Transit, a trade route established 800 years ago." "How could my ancestors know that?" Santa asked. "Because they helped build it," Ronan replied. "Your people weren't primitive natives the Confederacy discovered. They were part of the early wave of exploration." He gestured around the chamber. "This technology is ancient, but it's compatible with early Confederacy designs." "The elders lied," Santa whispered, "about everything." "Not everything," Ronan said, "but enough to maintain control." Senna slid from Ronan's arms, limping but steady now. Her eyes swept across the chamber with renewed purpose, taking in the ancient technology with fresh understanding. This was no accidental discovery for her. She reached under the torn strap at her hip and pulled out a broken tablet of black stone. Symbols glowed faintly in the volcanic light, pulsing with an inner energy that seemed to respond to her touch. "This is why they tried to burn me," she said, her voice softer now, heavy with the weight of revelation. Ronan frowned, stepping closer. The seal carved into the shard froze his breath. It was the insignia of the Confederacy. Not just any insignia, but the specific variant used by the Resource Acquisition Division. He had seen it on 100 documents during his time as an advisor. "Impossible," he whispered, reaching toward the tablet but stopping short of touching it. Her voice was low, bitter. "The elders are not punishing me for rejecting Krell. They're silencing me. They signed contracts to sell this world, land, sky, everything, to off-world corporations." He touched the shard, the truth burning colder than the lava around them. The tablet responded to his touch, additional symbols illuminating. Contract terms scrolled across its surface. Mineral rights, atmospheric processing permissions, population relocation clauses. "You weren't a heretic," he said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "You were a witness." Senna nodded, her blue fingers tracing one of the symbols. "I found this in Matron Kiva's private chamber. I was to be her apprentice before—" She swallowed. "Before I discovered what they had done. They sold us, all of us. The land we consider sacred will be strip-mined, our air harvested for rare gases. And we," her voice broke, "we are to be located to reservation territories." "These are resource extraction contracts," Ronan confirmed, scanning the text. "Signed by your elders in exchange for technology and weapons. The corporations get mining rights for 200 years. Your people get—" He paused, disgust evident in his voice. "Atmospheric processors that will make the surface habitable for the corporate workers, but not adjusted for your physiology. They're killing us slowly instead of quickly," Senna said. "More profitable that way." Ronan's expression hardened. "The contract includes cultural preservation zones where your people would be allowed to maintain traditional practices, under supervision. Living exhibits," Senna spat, "for tourists to gawk at. This violates at least 8 provisions of the Indigenous Protection Act, Ronan said. These contracts are illegal under Confederacy law. What does that matter? The corporations are already sending scouts. I've seen their ships at night. It matters because I can still report this, Ronan said. The Confederacy Oversight Committee can nullify these contracts. Why would they? The Confederacy benefits from these arrangements. Not all of the Confederacy is corrupt, Ronan insisted. There are still those who believe in the original mission, peaceful cooperation, mutual benefit. Like you. Santa's tone was skeptical, but not entirely dismissive. I was exiled for exposing similar contracts on Viridian Prime, Ronan said quietly. The corporations called it treason. I called it justice. From the tunnel came the clang of boots, the hiss of torches. Shadows swarmed at the entrance. The zealot guards had found them. Truth gave them no freedom. It painted a target on their backs. Ronan pushed Sienna behind him, scanning the chamber for weapons, exits, anything that might give them an advantage. The guards advanced in formation, their ceremonial armor gleaming in the dim light. They carried flame-tipped spears and ritual blades, but Ronan recognized the practical deadliness beneath the ceremonial design. There's another way out, Senna whispered, pulling him toward the far wall. Behind the star map. Krell led the zealot guards, his jaw bandaged but his eyes burning with hatred. Blood stained his ceremonial armor where Ronan's blow had shattered bone. Behind him stood Matron Kiva, her staff glowing with unnatural light. The heretic and the demon, she proclaimed, her voice echoing in the ancient chamber. The fire will have both. There's another way out, Sienna said urgently, pulling him toward the far wall. Behind the star map. Krell led the zealot guards, his bandaged jaw distorting his war cry. Behind him, Matron Kiva raised her staff, its ancient symbols pulsing with unnatural light. The heretic and the demon, she proclaimed. The fire will have both. Ronan spotted mining charges buried under centuries of dust. He quickly gathered them, assessing the chamber's structure with a trained eye. This will collapse the entrance, he said, positioning the charges. We'll have seconds to reach that exit. Senna worked at the star map, her fingers tracing specific patterns. I need more time, she called. Time is something we don't have, Ronan replied, ducking as a spear whistled past his head. The guards advanced in coordinated formation. Ronan engaged the first 3, his movements economical and lethal. But for each guard he disabled, 2 more pressed forward. A blade found his shoulder, slicing deep. He staggered, momentarily vulnerable. A second guard raised his spear for the killing thrust. Senna's hand shot out, pressing a symbol on the star map. The floor beneath the attacking guards suddenly retracted, sending them plummeting into a hidden chamber below. Their screams echoed briefly before being cut short. Ancestral security system, she explained with grim satisfaction. She reached for Ronan, pressing her palm against his bleeding shoulder. Their eyes met, understanding passing between them without words. She guided his hand to a specific point on the charges. Place them here, she instructed. The blast will be directed toward them. As the remaining guards regrouped, Senna stepped to Ronan. Her hand cupped his face and her lips met his. Not in desperation, but with fierce intent. For luck, she whispered. Kiva, unmoved by the display, lunged toward the control panel. Illusions! Tricks! As she brought her staff down to destroy the ancient technology, Ronan intercepted her, not with violence but by placing himself between her and the controls. The staff struck his shoulder, energy searing through his body. He collapsed and smoke rising from his wound. No! Sienna cried, rushing to him. The mountain itself responded to her distress. The floor beneath them liquefied, sweeping Kiva and her remaining loyal guards into one passage, while carrying Sienna and Ronan toward another. Ancient emergency protocols activated by extreme emotions. When the stone solidified, they found themselves on a ridge overlooking the village. Below, chaos erupted as the mountain trembled. Buildings cracked under continuous vibrations. Families fled in panic, carrying what little they could salvage. In the central plaza, warriors blocked escape routes under orders from the elders who remained. They were willing to sacrifice everyone to hide their betrayal. We have to reach them, Sienna said, supporting Ronan, whose wounds smoldered with unnatural energy. They descended along a path that crumbled beneath their feet. At the village perimeter, Senna climbed onto a fallen pillar, the data crystal held high. It projected its contents for all to see, their true history and the elders' betrayal in a display that could not be denied. A child pointed skyward where the holograms showed their ancestors' ships. "The Star Sailors," he gasped, repeating a forbidden nursery rhyme. An old woman fell to her knees, weeping. "My grandmother's stories were true." Matron Kiva appeared through the crowd, her staff raised. "Heresy!" she cried, but her voice no longer carried the same authority. The mountain shuddered. A massive fissure split the ground, separating Kiva from the villagers. Steam hissed from the opening, carrying the volcano's breath. A young mother clutching twin infants stepped away from Kiva's side of the divide. "I won't sacrifice my children for your lies," she declared, the first to openly defy an elder in generations. A warrior cast his ceremonial spear to the ground, where it shattered against stone. "My blade serves truth, not deception." Others followed his example, weapons clattering across the plaza. The village healer approached Sienna, touching the data crystal with trembling fingers. "The medicines I use, they're from the old knowledge, aren't they? Not magic, but science." "Yes," Sienna confirmed. "Knowledge your ancestors brought from the stars." Krell emerged from behind Kiva, his face twisted with rage. He carried not a ceremonial weapon but an ancient energy blade, another relic the elders had kept for themselves while preaching against technology. "Die, heretic!" he roared, leaping across the fissure toward Sienna. The people moved as one, forming a protective circle around her. Not warriors alone, but mothers, craftspeople, children, a unified wall of defiance against generations of control. Krell faltered before this wall of solidarity. For the first time in his life, intimidation failed him. His hand trembled, the energy blade flickering as his resolve wavered. An elderly woman stepped forward, the village's oldest citizen, keeper of forbidden stories. "I remember you as a child, Krell," she said softly, "before they twisted you with power and privilege. You used to draw the stars." The blade dropped from his fingers, deactivating as it clattered to the ground. Something cracked in his expression, the facade of cruelty giving way to long-buried humanity. The mountain gave a final, massive heave. The eastern flank collapsed in a thunderous avalanche. The elders who had refused to acknowledge truth were consumed by the physical manifestation of their lies, buried beneath tons of rock and ash. When the dust settled, survivors gathered in the field beyond the village. Hundreds of blue-skinned people, dazed and covered in ash, looked to Sienna and Ronan. Not with fear or blind obedience, but with the awakening of something long suppressed, hope. A little girl approached Sienna, offering a handful of wildflowers that somehow survived the devastation. "Are you really from the star?" she asked with childlike directness. "We all are," Sienna answered, kneeling to the child's level. "And someday we may return to them." Families embraced, weeping openly. Elderly villagers shared long-hidden artifacts with younger generations. Warriors transformed their ceremonial spears into tools for rebuilding. Ronan stepped forward beside Sienna, his wound still smoking from Kiva's staff, but his eyes clear. "By the oldest covenant between worlds," he said, his voice carrying across the gathering, "I stand with Sienna and her people." The words weren't a ritual formula or legal proclamation, but a simple truth, more powerful than any ceremonial vow. Sienna took his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. The gesture spoke volumes in a culture where women had been possessions, not partners. The sun set behind the damaged mountain, painting the ash clouds in gold and crimson. As darkness fell, someone lit a ceremonial fire, not for sacrifice but for warmth and community. People gathered around it, sharing stories long suppressed. An old man began to sing in a trembling voice, a melody forbidden for generations. Others joined hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as ancestral memories awakened in their blood. Days later, as twilight painted the sky with the colors of healing, Ronan and Sienna stood on the ridge overlooking the village. Below, their people worked to rebuild. Ancient observatories were being excavated. Children played freely, no longer segregated by gender roles. "What happens next?" Sienna asked, her shoulder brushing against his. Ronan's eyes lifted to the emerging stars, the same constellations mapped in the ancient observatory. "Your world finds its true path again." "And us?" Sienna asked, vulnerability momentarily visible beneath her strength. He turned to her, the answer requiring no complicated vows or legal formulas. "Together," he said simply, "if that's what you want." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire being. Her fingers touched the pendant at her throat. A fragment of ancient technology merged with volcanic glass, the past and future unified. A child's voice rose from the village below, singing one of the rediscovered melodies. Others joined until a chorus of voices reached toward the emerging stars. Sienna looked at her people, then to the heavens. No longer fearsome deities, but the beginning of a path her ancestors had once traveled. They meant to reduce me to ash, she said softly, her hand finding his. Instead, they forged me into fire.